and a podcast pioneer in Southeast Asia. So I remember consulting you in the early days for some advice in launching the podcast, and now I finally get to have you as a guest. So I'm so excited. For Could you introduce yourself pretty quickly?
Yeah, Jeremy, wonderful to be here. I remember that very well back in the old days. So I'm a podcast myself. I have podcasts, but my claim to fame, I guess, is that I have a podcast agency here in Singapore with a few Singaporean and Southeast Asian. So I help people tell stories on podcasts.
Amazing. So, how did you first get hooked into Southeast Asia and the region?
So I came from Southeast Asia from Japan in a roundabout way. I was living in Japan at the time. And the backstory is so if you go way back, Jeremy, in the 90s, I had a telecoms business, mobile phones in those days. You remember the big things? Like they were huge back then. And I'd lived in Japan in the early 90s and I'd seen, mid 90s, I'd seen Japanese high school girls essentially using phones in ways which nobody else was, like sharing, content, texting. And so when I moved back to the UK in late 90s, I was convinced that that could become a business, like telling people about what the mobile phone industry could be. So I knocked on all the doors of mobile phone companies, the Nokias and these kind of people back then that were big things. Ericsson, people don't know these names anymore, but they were global names. And they basically said, we don't do kids. They wanted a future which was about, old guys and big chunky mobile phones. I said, no, it's like teenagers, mobile phones. Eventually the market turned, you know, they got hold of the texting thing and mobile operators realized they could make a lot of money out of this. So we kind of rode that wave. And then 2012, I sold the business because it had run its course. And at that time, sat with my wife and my son, who was 6 at the time, in the kitchen. I remember the conversation, and it was like, "What do I do next?" Like, interesting, and I know, like, I've listened to many of the founders that came on your podcast. Is like the natural response to when you sell a business is to start another one because that's what all they know and that's what they're really good at. But I kind of wanted to do differently, so we decided to travel, and then we got everything into 3 suitcases and traveled the world for 4.5 years, just living on like tropical islands and stuff. So that brought us to Japan at one point, and then actually the bit about living on tropical islands was it's kind of lonely. So I started a podcast to talk to people in the Asian tech ecosystem. And then people started asking me, "Hey, how do I do that, Graham?" Like the conversation that we had. Like, how do I start my podcast? And then I realized it was a business. So we moved from Japan to Singapore in 2018 to set up a studio. So that was the beginning of it, Jeremy. And I'm here now.
And that's interesting because you started the podcast like many other folks because they're lonely, and clearly the only way to solve it is not by going to a dinner party or going for drinks and having a conversation there, but setting up a whole podcast. But of course, you only started it, but you also kept doing it, right? And I
Yeah.
think starting something is very different from choosing to continue doing it. So why did you choose to continue doing it? Because you moved to Singapore, you
Mm.
doubled down, but what was it about that kept you in the storytelling and podcast field?
Yeah, it's a great question. The consistency part, like, you've done well in excess of 200 episodes. And I don't think people realize what kind of effort goes into that. You've got to have all the systems and the workflows. That's important, isn't it? You've got to have all that kind of heavy lifting done. But beyond that, you've got to have a really good motivation for doing it. A lot of people go into podcasts and think, oh, I want to monetize this thing. But actually, the real value in doing it isn't in actually monetizing the podcast. It's the benefit of having a podcast. You get to meet people. You can certainly build a personal brand, and then there's sort of the intrinsic motivations of becoming a better storyteller, which you get good at. You listen to stories, you hear the patterns, and then you also are much better at expressing it yourself through practice. So I think, like I've seen with yourself and like myself, is that if you go into it with those motivations, not like how do I create a media entity or advertising real estate, then this thing, it's not like I'll do 100 episodes. It's like I'll do this forever because as long as this is relevant to me, I'll keep doing it. It's like a great way of meeting people. And for me, a vindication of that was, I, you know, got some meetings with some very senior um, business CEOs in the region. And for me, as a business development tool, it was phenomenal. I got in front of them, did deals with them, which I never would have done, if I was just a guy pitching, my services. So I realized actually that the way to monetize that is it for me personally, it was a great biz dev tool. I could have an hour with somebody, and then the follow on from that is let's do business together.
Amazing. And you know, you started talking a little bit about the reflections of doing a podcast, right? Because you have been doing podcasts for pretty much over 6 years,
Mm.
and I think that's really from the start of the era, right? In terms of like microphones and I don't know, even like AirPods.
Hosting, Jeremy, hosting. We didn't have it. Now it's so easy, right? Editing,
No,
hosting.
so could you share a little bit about what are the big differences that you see snapshot like before 6 years
Oh,
ago and perhaps now today? What would you say is the before and after?
well, actually, my first podcast as a podcast, because I was like recording audio interviews back in the early 2000s, but it wasn't really a podcast because you didn't host it like now. It wasn't even called a podcast then. But my first podcast is out there. It's on 2014, right? So this is in 2023. Would be 9 years ago, right? And it's still out there, but it's on only on YouTube now, right? Because it just goes to show back then what's really changed, Jeremy, is hosting. Like the hosting now is really good, it's robust, you've got tools, it's so easy to do things now. Like back then, it was like, you had to do this and then figure this out and then hack this. And then, like you've got to try and rewrite the RSS generation script. And you had to kind of have all these kind of skills, be a bit web development, a bit, like content creative and all those kind of things. You didn't just turn up and speak, which is what we can do now with the wonder of things like Riverside, for example. But I think like if you look at it at the very macro trend, and this has a big impact on yourself and myself as podcasters, is that the big macro trend. What's different now? It's much easier to produce, and it's much harder to promote. That's the macroeconomic supply and demand, isn't it? It's like now everybody can and does have a podcast. The competition for attention is severe. So gone are the days where you could produce a podcast and bang, you've got 10,000 listeners. That doesn't happen anymore. You've really got to hustle for it. So that's, I think, the main sort of top level understanding is that everybody can get in the game now. So there's a flip side and cost to that, right?
And what advice do you have for folks, right? Because, that's really on people's minds, right? Like a lot of folks are like, I want to set a podcast because I would like lots of people to listen to me.
Yeah.
How do you address that motivation? And how would you advise them on that motivation?
Yeah. This is a wonderful question. I'm glad you brought this up. Now, I worked very closely with people in radio, and this is what I learned from them to answer that question. Is that I worked with this sort of grizzled old radio DJ who's been in it far too long, as old as radio himself. But what he really knew was how to connect with his audience. And what he did, and this is what I saw him do, Jeremy, he cut out a photo. One of his readers sent him a photo. He cut it out and he stuck it on the microphone, and it was this woman reader, a fan, a listener, and he had that on the microphone. So every time he went on air, he looked at her and he talked to her. He never said "you guys," and he never said "the listeners out there." He said "you," and that really stuck with me because radio, radio is 100 years old. It should have been a sunset industry. As a VC, you never would have invested in radio, right? It was like always on the way out, but it stuck around. And the reason is because what radio does really well is they can speak to you. They know who you is. They know your name. They know exactly how old you are, what your job title is, and why you listen. They know everything that pisses you off, what you get frustrated about, your pain points, and they speak to that, right? They're very good at that. And so that brings us to the question about you asked very rightly, like, what advice would you give? Before you even start a podcast, you have to know who is you. Who are you speaking to? Because imagine you were running a radio show, you would want to know exactly who that person is. Have that photo of Jenny, whoever it is, and sticking it on your microphone. Who's that person? What are their pain points? What are the big macro trends right now that are keeping them up at night? And then just double down on that. When you speak to them, you know exactly who that person is and what they're worried about, and speak only to their problems and their pain, right? Don't try and be the expert, but instead show empathy. I really understand your problem, and this is what's happening in the industry, and this is the solution to that, right? And problem is, most people go into podcasting because it's very exciting, and they think, oh, I want to talk about this, and then they realize actually the market for this is pretty small because there's 5 million people with podcasts out there speaking about this, right? So the challenge is start with your audience avatar. And that's what we do. Whenever we take on a project, a new podcast, is that we always start there. Like, who is your audience?
Yeah, that's really good advice. For myself, I remember I got advice from I think the co-founder of Radiolab, and he was very much like, Jeremy, you just got to talk about something that sets your soul on fire. Right? And I was like, oh, he's like, this has to be a topic that you love talking about, even though no one's listening, because if you're excited about it, then someone else is going to be excited about it, right? And I was like,
I
oh, that's
love
such a
that
good
though.
thing as well,
Like,
right?
talk about something as if nobody's listening. Like, this is doubling down on what, it's not being everything to everybody, is it? It's being something to somebody. It's like, I don't care if you don't care about my thing, but I do. And there will be people out there that do. And, they've got choice. If you look at the numbers, Jeremy, like there's 5 million podcasters in the world, and the average person has 7 in their feed, right? So do the numbers on that. They're not going to put another one in there. But to get in that 7, you have to be something that you're passionate about, right? That sets you on fire. Because they're not going to go to another one, which is like, oh, this is a maybe. They're not going to stick around and listen to that guy.
I love the phrase 5 million podcast, right? Because there's the awkward reality is that anybody can host and anybody can speak,
Mm,
and I think it's interesting where I remember asking you in the early days to be like, hey, how did the podcast go? Some advice, and then I kind of reflect on that after 2 years, after like you said, over 250 episodes. I'm just kind of like, wow, such a noob back then.
well, you've done
Um,
200 up now. So,
Yeah, I know. So, I survived. And I think that was some of the advice you gave me back then, which is like kind of like, pod fade, right? I think you
yeah,
said like, like kind of like the
real.
concept that people give up after a certain amount of time. So could you share a little bit more about, I think, how folks should really feel about the 5 million podcasts and finding their voice or their
Yeah.
audience or, their process?
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? 5 million. Is it a lot? Well, compared to what, I guess, like that's the key here now is that, is it a crowded market or is it just getting started? And, like to put it into context, before the mobile phone business, I had a very short time in a web design business, which I set up, which was a complete failure, Jeremy. Um, but it kind of got me a start that obviously led to mobile as well. I had a year in that designing websites for money and actually could make money out of that. And back then in 97, 98, if you look at the numbers, what was really interesting was that there were 5 million websites in the world, right? And back then everybody said, look, this is really crowded. Like there's enough, like no more websites. And we hadn't even got to social media and we haven't even, like Google was only just getting on people's radars and Amazon was only just in a sort of a very few people in the US were using it, right? So 5 million in 97, 98, Netscape Navigator was the big thing. AOL CDs was how people got online. It was a very different world. People saw, the web back then just really as brochures, but in an electronic format. They actually even had something called brochureware. You could sell brochureware. You could go to a business and sell them brochureware, which is like we would scan your company brochure and put it online for you for a few $1,000s, right? That was a business that worked back then. But the interesting thing is, like, if you look now, there's like just under 2 billion websites in the world. So when people say to me about 5 million podcasts, it's like, okay, will that follow a similar trajectory? What's the trend here? Now, if you think about it, that why did people go to websites back then was because, well, if you go back to 97, 98, like if you wanted to go to a store, right, the most annoying thing was going to a store and it being closed because there was no way of finding out. So actually in 97, 98, the number one search term for e-commerce was store opening hours, right? People would Google or whatever search engine they use, the store opening hours. That's why people did it. And the reason is because it was so much easier to get information from a website than phoning up somebody in the switchboard, right? Engaged or you couldn't get through. And therefore, if you look at what websites were better communication interfaces than what was before them, right? They weren't brochures, they were better communication interfaces. Now, if you think about podcasts, like if you want to find out about a business, if you want to find out about startup founder, you don't go to the website and try and find out about them. Maybe the about page, right? That's where you probably start. But I bet you that they'll end up on Brave with Jeremy and listen to that founder because they want to know more about that person. They want to really go deep because they can't get that information. So the point is that if you look at the comparison, 5 million, we're only just getting started because, websites are to businesses what podcasts are to business leaders. If you think about it, better interfaces. So I see a future where it's not one brand, one podcast. No, it's going to be one brand might have hundreds of podcasts. And even in all these startups that come on your show, they could have three, four, five, a dozen podcasts, each different team, the CX team, the hiring team could have an internal podcast. So I think if you look at it like that, rather than, it's a brand thing, and look at it as a communication thing, and understand it's a way people can find out about what you're about, what you're passionate about, what you care about, then that really unlocks the potential of what this could be. And I think 5 million, we're only just getting started, Jeremy.
And you shared about how you found a business that failed, and you founded another business that is really helping many of these leaders get on their own podcast, right?
Mm,
And I think the thing I often feel when I listen to these corporate podcasts, and was just chatting a little bit about it, is that they're so boring, right? So vanilla. Like anything human has been chipped away. It's all corporate speaking points, and it's boring, right? And is I obviously know that they are very interesting people when I meet them for dinner or in person or especially somewhere private. But it feels like on a podcast, it just become generic, right?
mm.
So what's up with that? Why do you think that happens, and how are people trying to address it?
Yeah, it's early days. We're taking baby steps. We have to realize that what you and I can speak about is not what a CEO can speak about, because what he speaks about might affect the share price. With us, we've got a lot of bandwidth. We can talk about what we want. Maybe we might get an angry email, but that's about as far as it goes. So we have to understand that it's still, you know, to get to where we are, even having a corporate podcast is an advance from where we were. You know, we shouldn't compare podcasts to marketing. We should compare it to communications. So we're really looking at podcasts as opposed to press releases or white papers or analyst lunches. So in that sense, it's a lot more human. It's an advance. Yes, you're right. We have a long, long way to go. We're sort of looking at websites in '97, Jeremy, and judging them by today's standards. So I think that to get it forward, the first thing is to start the podcast, build confidence in it as well. Then have ownership in it rather than it being a brand thing. You want business leaders to say, this is my podcast, right? Because then they can inject that character into it rather than sort of being a carousel of all, kind of like a dumpster for everybody, all their corporate content, right? That's not interesting. But if you have, for example, a CEO or any leader internally have a podcast and people get to know them and they can kind of humanize it a bit, that's a step forward again. We're not going to get true crime type podcasts in the world of corporates in the short term, but it's baby steps, right? I absolutely agree. That we have to build the confidence, and they have to buy into this idea of podcasts, right? You're talking about head of comms, right? Or a corporate leader who's from the world of PR, where it's all about control, isn't it? It's all about efficient messaging. It's a pipeline as opposed to a platform, isn't it? So to even get to that stage, I think it's a step. I would hopefully, we're starting to see good ones. We are emerging. We're starting to see interesting takes on it, and the platform evolving, right? But it's going to take time. But if there's any encouragement, it's look at where we came from. It's this versus corporate communications, which is very dehumanized, right?
No, I love what you said, which is I think you know pushing one layer lower, which is away from the company brand,
Mm,
like Kraft, Heinz, Altria, Shell, and then speaking about the individual voice of the leader, right?
mm,
And um,
absolutely, because people follow people, not brands. That's the reality today. Is that you may be aware of a brand, but your experience of a brand is defined by your interaction with the people of that brand. So the people are the brand, right? That's the experience. That what you see and interact with becomes the brand. More important than the logo, more important than the marketing campaign. So it's how do you empower your people, unlock that human potential inside these organizations that they can tell stories, right? That's the storytelling organization. That's the kind of promised land we need to get podcasting to, where you can empower people at all levels, that diversity of voice in the organization. Because, if I listen, even like at the podcast level, if I listen to Brave, it's not because necessarily of the subject, it's because of you, right? I'm interested. I find out about it because of the subject, but it's like, oh, this Jeremy chap's really interesting. He's on a journey. He used to be a VC, like all those, or comes from the world of VC, um, you know, and he's a bit of an entrepreneur himself. He's got some opinions. That's what we need to do in the world of podcasts with corporates. It's like, who is the CEO? Who is the head of customer success? Who is the, whatever it may be, and we need to humanize them, and that's what we believe in. And you can look at the data as well. I mean, take a look at LinkedIn. If you look at your listeners, so you out there, go and have a look at Microsoft's page on LinkedIn. I'm not singling out Microsoft. Every brand does this. They've got 13 million followers on LinkedIn. And when they post on LinkedIn, their posts get like 4 or 5 likes. I'm not joking. 4 or 5. Even my worst posts get more than that. Right, the ones I really didn't try hard with, they get more than that, right? But then Satya Nadella can post and get thousands, and it's there. That's telling us straight that what people engage with is that it's the people. So we need to give tools to all of our people and allow them to tell the story within the guardrails of on brand, within the sort of safe space. And that really is engaging. I think that's where we've got to get to with a storytelling organization. We're well away from it. It's like, 97 trying to dream up what social media could be. We're sort of 10 years away from it.
love how you differentiated the voice between the corporate level and the Microsoft anecdote versus, I think, the voice at the individual level.
Mm,
And I think, it kind of touches, I think, a point about, political correctness, right? Which is, I think a big part about why, people come across vanilla is they feel like they're talking to a billion people, right?
yeah.
And the stuff that's universally agreed upon by a billion people is very low, I think. I think people even disagree about basic stuff, right? Like, I don't know. At a billion people, I think people argue about whether the Earth is flat or round, probably
Yeah.
at a quantum, right? And I think that's something I was starting to realize recently. Is like, when I'm talking to myself as a crazy person, like every other human being, I hold a lot of individual beliefs, right? That,
Mm,
like you said, can be disagreeable, can be a point of view, can be a hypothesis, can be a belief. Um, and then, you add me and my wife, and even I start filtering with my wife because, you know,
of
there's
course.
just some stuff she doesn't believe in me, and there's some stuff about her that I don't believe in. But we keep the peace, right? Just dodge the topic. And then you add five people, and then and there's a stranger there, and then you're even more guarded, right? And then you add 10, 100,000, million, billion, and then I think that's why you kind of like I think that's driving the vanilla side, right? Because you
Yeah.
rub off anything that's disagreeable. So what's the right approach? How should people think about it, right? Should it be like just say a piece, be authentic, go for it, versus like what's the right approach, right?
Yeah. You've definitely identified what the challenge is, Jeremy, and that's the fear, isn't it? And obviously, the bigger the audience you're speaking to and the bigger the stage you're on, the more likely you're going to have somebody who disagrees with you. And today, the challenges is that the people who disagree have power, they have a voice, they can express it. You only need one person to call you out politically incorrectly and you're in trouble, right? You only have to say something a couple of years ago and then you get cancelled. So it's a climate of fear, and that's the challenge, isn't it? That how do you express yourself and not be subjected to that, especially if you're in a public eye? And if you look at the data, I mean, there's some interesting data about. I think Edelman did some research about what defines a thought leader, and people want strong opinions, but it sort of goes back to like Ray Dalio says, strong opinions loosely held. I think that's really important. That people don't want controversial opinions; they want strong difference, isn't there? That they want you to take a stand. They want you to have an opinion and not just be an interviewer or not just be a platform for everybody else to have an opinion. That's what they want, that you have a voice. It's something, but you're not deliberately trolling people for attention, right? Which is a different game entirely, like picking fights with people and so on, like on social media. So I think that's the key. There's a difference between those people who caught um, controversy and those people who plant a flag and let people rally around it. It's quite different. I mean, there is an overlap in the middle, but I think, yeah, and you will, like they said, like, do pigeons crap on the heads of statues of critics? No, because they don't build statues to critics, right? So if you're going to have a statue to somebody, you're going to get crapped on the head, right? And so it's the point. If you have an opinion, you are going to attract, the detractors. But the point is that you don't have to deliberately court it to get attention. So I think it's not to be afraid somehow. And, people are forgiving generally enough if you come from a position of authenticity, right? If you say things out of curiosity, you can talk about controversial issues without being controversial. You can address it. You can have guests, and you can say your opinion. But if you do it out of a position of curiosity and an open heart, if you like, I think people are okay with that.
That's still scary, right? It's just like, go out there and speak with an open heart, and people will still shit on you,
Yeah.
on your statue.
Well, I think if they're not, then you have to ask if you're actually making any difference, right? I suppose it is a moniker of making a change, isn't it? If you weren't, if you look at, I mean, everybody talks about leadership now, Jeremy, and if you have a podcast, it's a platform to be a leader. You can take it or not. And if you look at great leaders throughout history, is they always took the path of most resistance, meaning they did what was necessary as opposed to what was popular. And I think that's it, isn't it? Like, if you have an opinion just to get popular, it's different from having opinion because you believe in change, positive change, right? So, it's kind of like, if you think about the world as rock stars and politicians, right? Like, politicians' game is to win 51% of the audience, isn't it? That's how they win. First past the post, or the majority. That's their DNA and their sort of MO. That's how they roll, right? So effectively, like you say, is that they'll just water everything down. They mollify all their critics by just saying nothing. And even if you ask politicians, like, what do you think about this? They'll do everything they can to not tell you, like, just deflect it. And but nobody cries when a politician dies, right? It's very rare. But rock stars, they don't care about 100% of the market. They speak to 10% of the market. That's what they care about. They know that they'd rather be loved than liked, because if you're liked, you might as well be invisible, right? These days. But if you're loved, you know, look at how these guys interact with crowds. Like rock stars, crowd surfing, politician hiding behind like a glass bulletproof shield, right? That's the difference here. It's like making a difference. Like, nobody, rock stars slightly are a little bit on the edge, but those are the people we care about. Those are the people that make a difference, whether it's a rock star or comedian, some cultural commentator. Those are the people we listen to, who can actually make a change. If you want to know about politics, you don't listen to a politician, you listen to a comedian. They're the ones that actually have the finger on the pulse, right? And if you want to change things, socially, it's through music or through culture. So, that's the choice we have to make. If we want to make a difference, we have to accept some form of criticism. But if you can surround yourself with good people who, your sort of band of merry men on this journey, then it doesn't matter.
Love what you just said about, kind of like the merry band and, finding your rock star voice. It reminds me of this thing, which is like, CEOs get to fire the employees they don't like and who don't like them, right? But
Yes.
politicians have, they have to win 50.1% of the vote and they have to represent 100% of the country.
Yeah.
And I think that's the, kind of goes back to what we just talked about, the political correctness slash,
Mm.
boundary, right? Voice, right? Versus the rock star who's like, hey, if 1% of the population really loves you and 99% thinks that, I don't know, you're Satan,
Yeah.
you know, that
Doesn't
still
matter.
works, right?
Yeah. But if you look at rock stars and the things that they do, normal people wouldn't get away with. But people, oh, it's fine. He's a rock star. You know,
Be a rock
that
star,
yeah,
right?
I mean, they were the first ones to kind of like cross dress and man dresses up as a woman, woman dresses up as a man. It's like, oh, it's fine. He's a rock star. It's fine. But now it's kind of like, okay, that they were doing this like back in the 70s. Like you think about people like Bowie, for example, challenging like norms, which are just would accept it now. So you've got to have a little bit of that, and that sort of inner voice, if you like. And I don't think there's nothing to be scared of. I don't feel like people aren't actively seeking out podcasts on LinkedIn, on Apple or on Spotify and looking for something controversial. It's the difference between doing it in Twitter, because in Twitter you're doing it to 100% of the audience, right? That's the difference. If you do it on Twitter, um, you're speaking to 100%, and I guarantee a group of them are going to hate it and call you out and cancel you. But if you do it on a podcast, it's different. It's not speaking to a mass audience. People are searching you out. So if somebody's searching out Southeast Asia startups, they're going to find your podcast, Jeremy. They're not going to listen to it and go, "Oh, this is not how we do it in the Valley." It's like tough. It's not for you guys in the Valley. It's for us, right? It's our stories. So I think that's really important. You're selling to the sold, right? You're not trying to sell to people who aren't sold on the message, and that's why I think it's a lot safer to do it in your, to own your media and do it on your stage.
Yeah, I love that about your stage and your journey and voice. So, personally, what would you share in terms of a story of bravery in your personal life?
Yeah. As this is the Brave podcast, I should have had something in my personal life. I think, I have a story which probably a lot of people identify with, and that is that um, departure. And that is like at 2012, after we sold that business, we uh, packed everything into three suitcases. So we didn't just sell a business, we sold a house and car and everything, and had nothing. We owned nothing apart from three suitcases of stuff. And like, yeah, all the photos and the family photos we gave to the grandmother, and she sort of parked those and looked after them. But everything else, like the practical stuff, was in three suitcases. And then we bought a one-way ticket and flew to New Zealand, which is the other side of the world, to London, right? So we bought a one-way ticket over there, three of us, and my son wasn't in school, and I wasn't working. And then we just started our adventure. We didn't have a plan; we just went for it. And we actually ended up at one point, apart from like we went through Hawaii, Fiji, um, a few of the sort of like Pacific islands, went through America, landed on a group of islands off the west coast of Africa, the Canary Islands, and they're politically part of Spain, but geographically part of Africa, and it's sort of like volcanic archipelago. So we landed there, and everybody speaks Spanish. I didn't speak Spanish, and my wife didn't speak Spanish, and my son didn't speak Spanish. So, but we wanted to get my son into a local school, so we went. I remember because at that time, I don't know what I think I had to sort some paperwork out, but my wife took our boy, 6 at the time, to the school. And it was like this little village school on top of the hill, like a real sort of like as you'd imagine a Spanish school, all the sort of singing and dancing going on. And she took them there, and I remember she told me when she got to this tiny little school, she walked up to the office just on the window, knocked on the door on the office window, sorry, and the window opened and somebody poked their head out, and in Spanish it's like, "What are you doing? What do you want?" And there's this like she's Japanese, so there's this like Japanese woman standing there holding the hand of this 6-year-old boy, And like they didn't speak Japanese or English. She didn't speak Spanish, but somehow this was like on a Thursday. They managed to get my boy into school on Monday, the following Monday, because we thought it would take months, but when it got down to it, they called out the English teacher, the Spanish English teacher, and they managed to figure it out. Said, "Oh, well, when do you want to start? We'll start Monday." So, like, when I think back of it, it's just kind of a bit crazy. Like, you would never kind of plan life like that. But I think that's what bravery is. It's like, if you look at the word brave, like courage, it actually comes from the Latin word heart, right? Even in Spanish, like the word is corazón, which means heart, like it's courage. And, really, what courage is the opposite in the heart. We talked about it today. It's the opposite of fear. Like every day we have a choice. Like we have a pathway in front of us. And, we can choose the pathway of fear or we can choose the pathway of heart. And that's bravery, isn't it? Like it's being vulnerable. It's like even small things like, doing a podcast. Like, should I do it? That's the path, isn't it? It's like, should I edit it down or do I get on stage? That's being brave. And it's the same, like we've mentioned with the corporate podcast. Do I follow the path of heart, which is like to open up and be vulnerable, say I made a mistake, or do I, follow the path of fear, which is edit it down and be, very vanilla, right? As you mentioned. And that's it. I think that's what bravery is. That's my story. And that's what it taught me is like, you can take these decisions and take these pathways and it's okay. It's not fatal, right? You don't die doing it. You maybe make a lot of mistakes and get burnt, but here's the great thing, Jeremy, is you have a story worth telling at the end of it, right? Because imagine if you didn't do that, you wouldn't like all those things, all those experience we had, we would never had a story. And that's what it is. That is all life is. It's just a collection of stories put together, right? It's not like this big sort of monolithic thing. It's just lots and lots of little incidences and events, right? And it's packaged with this sort of bookends, right, of a story. And that is to bravery is to actually live it and to take risks and you know try and make sense of it as you go along.
Love what you shared about, your one-way ticket. Uh, and that really resonated with me, in the context of bravery. What other one-way tickets have you done from your
Oh,
perspective?
I like that. Yeah, I like that. I never thought of it that way, Jeremy. And that's the beauty of doing a podcast. If somebody says something back to you, and you're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to steal that. I'm going to use that in my own podcast now." One-way tickets. Yeah, it's the departure, isn't it? If you think about it, every great movie you've ever watched, Jeremy, every book you've ever read that was really enthralling, has a departure. The hero leaves, right? And often they never chose to leave, but you know, events chose them. That sort of accidental hero narrative. So we depart, and often in these stories, there's a physical departure, isn't there? In Lord of the Rings, he leaves Hobbiton and goes on the journey. He crosses the river physically. And then in Star Wars, Luke leaves the planet, doesn't he, and flies off in search of truth. And Harry Potter, he gets on a train. There's like a physical departure. So there's been many one-way tickets. I think, like uh, it's really defined by leaving something behind. And for me, most recently, it was leaving Japan and moving here when I was sort of semi-retired. Um, and I could have just kind of lived out my days, but it's not what it's about. This is what it's about, Jeremy. It's like, getting to talk to you. That's what for me it's about. It's like, having these conversations, stories, like getting inspired by other people's stories. But I had to depart to do that. I had to say, okay, I'm going to take a risk. I have to leave behind Hobbiton, right? I had to leave behind Tatooine, my home, and then go in search of truth. And I think, that's a big departure, like upping sticks, moving your family to a new home. And it's risky and it's not easy and it's full of, it's going to have a lot of shit happen along the way. That it's not going to be all sunshine and rainbows. But then there are lots of mini departures, aren't there? Like day to day, there are like sort of mini like, versions of that playing out. Like it could be like starting your podcast, or it could be, like saying something that you feel a little bit um, exposed in saying. So I think, a good test of like departure is like, for example, if you're going to say something and or you do a podcast and you're nervous, I think that's a good sign because if you stop having that feeling, then you're not leaving anything behind, right? I think that's probably a good test. If you're doing that every day in your own way, little things like little departures, then you're growing as a person.
You made me suddenly feel like life is the ultimate one-way ticket, right? You
Well,
get
it is.
born,
Are you coming
and
back,
then
Jeremy? Have you got a return ticket?
your destination is like death, right?
It
It's
is.
all one way,
It
baby.
is. It is. It ain't going back. We haven't worked out how to reverse this thing yet. But isn't it so like I don't know, like it's kind of you I there's a certain generation, isn't there? And I think a lot of people, maybe your peers as well, my peers, they live it as if like they've got to get to the end. And that end could be retirement. And especially once you have family and you start to get a bit older and you're not so invincible anymore, you realize how important time is, right? And that it really is a one-way ticket. And we're on this journey which we can't reverse yet. I see what Elon Musk could do about that, but we don't have a cure for it. So it's kind of like I think that's the point, isn't it? Like so many people sort of wait to get to retirement to arrive. It's like they work their whole life and they do, they sort of sacrifice their voice. They stuff it down deep inside of them, such that when they get to retirement, they can actually enjoy. Which to me is like, wait a minute, you're taking a big bet here. Like, firstly, if how many years have you got to go before you kind of don't get run over or get sick, or the chances of making retirement without having any kind of disease or mental faculties in place I don't know, it's probably less than 50%. Like if you have a partner as well, certainly is less than 50% for both of you. So I look at it and say, like, let's not wait to go travel the world, let's do it now. And then when I'm 65, maybe I've lost it, then I'm not regretting anything. So that's the one way ticket, isn't it? It's like not trying to get to the end of it and unscathed, but to get there with a few scars.
Getting there with few scars, and being nervous is a good sign. I think that's
Oh
an
yeah.
interesting philosophy, right? Because what you're kind of saying, if I'm reading between the lines here, is like, you know, do you want to live life in an air-conditioned room the entire time, right? In terms of emotion and so
Mm,
forth. But being nervous is a sign that you're out of your comfort zone.
yeah. Do you get nervous before every episode? Just a little bit.
A little
Anticipation,
bit, I think,
tingling.
especially I think the more of a strangers, obviously.
Uh,
I think when it comes to folks I've talked to, which I try to do it most of the time these days, then less nervous and more excited
yeah.
because I'm looking forward to it, right? I mean, it's probably like the best conversation of the day.
Yeah.
Don't tell everybody else who I had a conversation with earlier in the day, because
He says
a
that
lot of
to
those
everybody.
conversations, a lot
Yeah.
of those conversations are transactional, right? It's about
Yeah.
business, about networking, it's about pitches, it's about business models, it's about helping one another. And all those things are obviously part of the relationship. It's just that I think I always say, like, some meals are appetizers, some meals are desserts, and some meals are steak, right? And
Yeah.
I
I
want
like
a
that.
steak meal, for our conversation.
Juicy. Yeah, I like that. I like your analogies as well. It's a good sort of use of it. I always think about, people ask like, why do you podcast? And it's kind of, uh, I think I'm a bit older than you, Jeremy. So, um, when I was a kid at school, obviously I was very fascinated by the shuttle, sort of NASA. They were going on. They're still launching these things back then. So I remember at school they would sort of gather all the kids around and sit in front of a big old-fashioned wooden television set in the hallway, and all the kids would watch, like gripped as this thing sort of launched. And I loved all of that. For me, it was like, oh my god, this is like the best thing in the world. Like it's amazing. They're going to the moon and all those kind of things. And I loved all of that. And they wrote all these books about space, and I was so into that. And I remember like this one book about why do we choose to go to the moon. And they basically said that one of the big benefits of the space shuttle, because it cost billions of dollars, right, it was very, very expensive, was that they discovered Teflon. Now, for those of you who don't know, Teflon is what they make non-stick pans out of, like frying pans. And it was like, this is why we're doing it, guys, Teflon. It's like, oh, okay. At the time, even as a kid, I was like, I'm not quite. Is that really why we're doing it? Like, to make frying pans? But that was like the whole case. The business case for building the shuttle was frying pans. But as I get older, I realized actually that's not what it was about. it's like the podcast. Like you don't do this because it's, oh, I can make money out of this podcast. It's, I see it as the reward, right? For me, it's like we choose to go to the moon like JFK style, right? Because it's the hard thing, because we enjoy it, because it's the core of mankind's DNA, adventure, challenge, right? And what bigger challenge can you have than to, launch a rocket, or to, tell your story on your terms, right? And that, to me, like you say, it's the stake. It's, you don't do it for any other reason apart from the enjoyment of eating that thing, right? You love eating the steak. Sure, there's some nutritional value in it, right? But the actual eating of the steak is like, yeah, I'm really getting into this. And I think that's what the podcast is about. And that's why people should think about it in those ways. It's the reward as opposed to some vehicle to get to a reward. And if you do it with that in mind, then you'd easily make this a long-term thing.
I love what you just shared about, Teflon being a terrible reason to go to the moon
It's like it's
and
still in
very
the books.
uncompelling as well.
I know. And I
Uh,
know as a VC, you've probably heard some really weird pitches in the time. Can you imagine somebody came to you, hey, Jeremy, I want you to fund this thing. It's going to cost you a few billions, but it's going to help us make cheap frying pans. Like, okay, let me have a think about this one.
I think it's all about justification versus, like you said, the true stake, right? What is the real core of it?
Yeah.
And I think it's easier to dodge behind Teflon than it is to say, like you just said, right? Adventure. And everyone's going to be like, adventure? Anyway, and then everyone just shits on you. A billion people shits on you simultaneously for being authentic enough to say adventure, right? So you say Teflon, and everyone's like, okay, I don't know what that word is, but sounds, smart,
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
good enough, right? So yeah, on that note, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love
Oh,
to summarize the three big themes. I think the first, thank you so much for sharing about the 5 million podcasts
mm,
that there are today. And also contrasting that to the fact that there once were 5 million websites, right? And the website slash the internet has only grown since then. And I think, your faith and conviction that podcasts can only grow as in terms of, not just ease, but also numbers, but differentiation and niche is really interesting from a trends perspective, but also from a macro and personal perspective. The second thing, of course, is thank you for sharing about how to find your rock star voice uh, versus politicians who are kind of like triangulating for the lowest common denominator of a billion people versus finding your 1% of people who truly love you. And I love how you talked about how breaking norms and being able to fundamentally lead, because leadership fundamentally is about having the fact that people dislike you to some extent for what you stand for. And I think thinking through about what you stand for and letting people rally to your flag versus kind of like trying to like be something to everyone. Um, Lastly, thanks for sharing about one-way tickets.
mm,
I think I love how we talked about your one-way ticket to Asia, to Spanish and school for your kid, and I think all of that, and I think going on to broaden that out to one-way tickets in life, right? In terms of the adventures that we're trying to have. And I actually really appreciated you saying that, hey, if you're nervous, that's a good sign, right? That's
mm.
a sign that you're out of your comfort zone and you're doing something new, and there's some level of call to adventure for Hobbiton and Tatooine, right? So I love all of that storytelling. So thank you so much, Graham, for coming on the show.
Oh, it's wonderful. I really enjoyed this, and I can see why you've done over 200 episodes. You're so good at this, and that summary at the end was just like, that was such so well done. Like I'm sitting here making mental notes and thinking, wow, you really got that. And it's so nice to hear that somebody gets it and then interprets it in their own way and sort of hands it back to you. And I really, really appreciate that. And what you're doing with this podcast as well, like, this is really the a beacon podcast here in Southeast Asia. So I hope that this goes on for a long time. A one-way ticket to the end of the journey with Jeremy. Keep this podcast going, brave. So I do really appreciate that, and really kind of giving it a voice, a local voice as well, importantly. And thanks for having me on the show today. I've had a lot of fun.
So did I. Thank you so much.